we're talking about value today. You've all read the Chiaroscuro chapter in the text that was available to you on Foxtail as 2 different PDFs, part 1 and part 2. It would be helpful if you read all that if you haven't already before you get into watching this video. And some of you have had, or most of you have had by now, potentially your value demo by your faculty member who's teaching drawing. So this is another refresher reminder and possibly a different approach than what your faculty member took in your class, but hopefully it'll help you. You know, sometimes when we come at these concepts from a couple different sort of points of view and practices and techniques, it can be really rich and improve everybody's understanding. So a couple things you're gonna need for today. First of all, I already have this kind of like drawing set up really just in line. And I haven't begun to think too much about line quality at this point because as you're going to see as we start to apply value and determine what's happening with the value in this picture, the line quality is going to sort of deteriorate and then we're going to have to pull it back in and tighten it back up. So I've just essentially like made sure that I have a good base drawing. Applying value to a drawing that's not correct and has proportional problems or problems with intuitive perspective, problems with negative positive shape is just going to add another layer of problems. So you want to take your time and build up to this stage with care and intention and best practices of all the techniques that you've used so far. So the subject's over here. I've used my viewfinder. I've really thought about the framing of this composition through my viewfinder. I've thought a lot about and fussed and taken care of. You can see I've got construction lines that I've sort of wiped out for making sure that I'm symmetrical, thinking about biomorphic form, thinking about intuitive perspective and negative positive shape. So I've got a decent composition here, and I'm going to start going in and thinking about what's happening with the value of the light and dark. So I've got a chamois that I've been using for a while. It's pretty dirty. Got myself some vine charcoal, different bits. I also have some compressed charcoal, okay? So the vine charcoal is basically just a burnt stick. The compressed charcoal is the carbon and the charcoal that comes off of that process, but then it's been compressed by machine and it has a little binder in it to keep it from falling apart completely. And then I also have a piece of Conte crayon, black Conte crayon. My students at least have this in their kits, hopefully everybody has that. And that's very similar to the compressed charcoal, but it's smaller, thinner, and it's got a little bit more binder in it, so it can give you a sharper, harsher line. And when you do your value scales, this guy and the Conte crayon and the compressed charcoal are going to give you a lot more depth, and you're going to get to sort of more of a true black than with vine charcoal. But we're going to start with vine charcoal. And I have the rest of these here. I also have my value scale, which lots of you have made a value scale in the past, and you may have done it along with this unit, depending on what class you're working in. I'm trying to get to 10 value steps within each media that we're using in class. So I have a 4B pencil, Conte crayon, vine charcoal, and compressed charcoal. And essentially what this assignment is about, or this technique is about, is kind of mapping these values onto this drawing based on what you see. One of the things that's going to be helpful to think about is just beginning the process by determining what the local color of any object is. And that term local color is essentially what value, how do you translate the color of the object into a value, into grayscale, because we're not working with a polychromatic problem here, we're working just with a monochromatic value, continuous tone drawing. How do you map and translate the local color of anything, which is just its value in average light, not considering highlights, shadows, reflected light, anything like that. Just basically, if you were to kind of make a swatch of that color, translate it to grayscale, where would it be on the value scale? So I've got some objects here that are already a range of values within their local color, and I know I'm going to find various values to map onto my drawing based on what I see. So I've got a white object. I've got some bright colored fake pears. I've got this light, sort of pale gray picture, and then a black, painted black cube that's resting on, and then obviously the foreground of the support that this is sitting on, this kind of like shelf table thing for still lifes, and then a back wall. It's a simple drawing. You don't want to, when you're starting out in value, you don't want to give yourself a really complex drawing problem. You want to be able to deal with objects that you've already managed before. and you kind of know maybe a little bit about, so you don't set yourself up with a crazy problem. Okay, so basically I'm just going to start by trying to consider what values I have here. And, you know, in the chiaroscuro chapter, you'll remember the author asking you to squint so you can control the aperture of your eye, and it will give you, really sort of increase the contrast and give you a strong sense right away of like where your darkest darks and lightest lights are. So if I'm looking for a value 10 or 9, something really at the high end here of the value scale, I'm going to squint and I see right away, obviously, the darkest dark in this picture is going to be that black cube. So what I don't want you to do is kind of like, you know, sketch out sort of like lines here in the cube. I want you to turn your drawing material on its side and really get kind of broad sort of layers of value going in. So this is Vine Charcoal. And I start with Vine Charcoal because it's really malleable as a material. You can see already what I meant by, you know, losing a little bit of that line quality and clarity of edge. As I start working, you know, this gets really soft, but I can, you know, fix that at any time. So this isn't quite a value 10. It's maybe, you know, between a 7 and an 8, but we can get it darker. I don't want to lose my line. Completely, so I'm going to go back and clarify where necessary. Then I'm going to squint again and look for the next darkest thing that's happening, and it's kind of the cast shadow that's behind this object. And we're looking for kind of general shapes here. Your negative positive shape study in the past will help you. Got a fair bit of darkness down here. And some cast shadow back in here. And then I've also actually got a cast shadow back here, which is kind of strange, but it's this board casting a shadow on the whole scene there. All right, so that's definitely all of my sort of darkest darks. Right now, my lightest lights are on this object, which makes a lot of sense because it's a white object. So you're going to have like that full translation to the lightest value here. I'm going to, you know, I've got kind of my darkest darks in here. Next, I'm going to go in and start thinking about sort of where the next, you know, how to map the local color of this. And it's kind of like a value 2 maybe. So I just want to get some information on there. Now that might sort of start as kind of like bigger, darker than a value 2. This sort of handle is already close to a value 2, maybe a 3. But then I can use my chamois, since this is Vine Charcoal, just to knock that back down and lighten it up a little bit. And it's maybe even a little darker up in here. Okay, when I squint, I see that yellow green of the pear, for the most part, maybe kind of close to also a value 2, maybe a 3. So again, give a little information there. Knock it back a little bit. Same thing here, and then kind of pay attention to where the light's coming from. Knock that back a little bit. Within the white object, you know, it's got some value 1 on it, but it's not totally a 1. So I'm going to give a little kind of wash in here too, and then knock back as needed. So value, just like line, just like proportion. A value system is the same as any other device that we've used, any other kind of technique that we've used over the course of this class. It's all about comparison. So you want to build the drawing like this across the page, up and down, left and right. You don't want to get really specific about any one object and its value yet. You don't want to fuss too much on really what's happening with anything, because it needs to exist in concert and context with the rest of the picture. So we can't really know the specifics about this friend if we don't understand what's happening here. So we'll just, beginning to map with the scale and work through the drawing together. Don't spend any too much time on any one object, but just overall get some of that information happening. We're a little darker on the edges here. But even then within that, I can kind of knock back a little bit, think about where the light's coming from. You want a sense of light and a sense of value over your whole picture, and you want it to make sense as an environment and not simply, each individual object. So it needs to make sense that the light source sort of feels consistent and believable over the whole picture. So again, the background's not white. We forget about the distant ground in the background a lot when we're drawing, especially when we're starting with line. But you want to really consider it, because it will help your drawing feel more believable, and it gives the viewer more information when you add value. So, even for me now, I see the distant ground, that backboard, as being darker than both this little jug and this vase. I want you to keep your fingers out of your drawing. Everybody's tempted to, get in there and rub things around and smooth things out. First of all, we don't really want to smooth things out, okay? You don't want to polish your drawing. You want to add texture as you're adding value. You want to have a sense of, the way you apply the value, that it's communicating something about the object itself. So as I continue to work and move through this picture, I may sort of change the direction of how I'm applying the material. There's some wood grain on the back of this, so I might do an emphasis on sort of more of a vertical mark here. And the wood grain goes in this direction across the surface, so I might, apply my material with a horizontal line here. That'll help us remember, what the difference between the back of this surface and this surface here that's kind of coming out and giving more. Again, everything that you do, you don't want it to be arbitrary. You want it to be thoughtful and have a reason for doing it. All the formal elements are, you're having a reason for why this is happening. Let's just straighten that out. Okay? So we're starting to build, some value up on here. In a very short period of time, you can see some things are starting to happen. Again, we don't want to stick our fingers in this picture and smooth things out with our fingers, because, the sense of mark, and there goes my tool. Good thing I have a lot more. Sense of mark and sort of the texture with which you apply the value is really helpful. Also, everybody has just naturally oils in their fingers, in their skin, and in their fingers. And so, as you work, those oils are going to get into your picture. And then what happens is that oily substance can kind of lock in material, and it'll keep you from being able to manipulate it later. So I've got some sort of translation of local color on each object. I'm going to have to keep building those values as time goes by and working slowly. In some points, I'm going to go back and sort of start to refine the line quality a little bit so that I can give more information to the viewer about what any given object is, what it's doing, where it is. We talked about atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective applies to value too. You can have something that is the same local color, but if it's further away from a light source, and my light source is sort of overhead, frontal here, it's going to have less light on it, so it's going to end up being darker in space. Okay, so you want to kind of be paying attention to that. And I mentioned sense of light earlier. You want to make sure as you're developing each object within your still life that the cast shadows, you know, which fall under typically an object or behind an object, that those make sense for the direction of the light. You want to make sure that if there's any highlights. And typically when you begin in drawing one, you'll notice there's a lot more subtlety with highlight than what you might be used to when you come from your past drawing experience. So typically a highlight isn't a bright white hole in the page. It's just more of a lighter light. So, and in those cases, rather than using a chamois, we may want to pull out an eraser. So for example, if I'm paying attention to this pair here, I'll go back and we've got one of the ways, you know, like true lines don't exist in nature in the way that we think they do. Really, line is kind of, in a continuous tone drawing and how our eye perceives it, it's two values meeting. So in order to kind of think about the contour of this pair and what's really happening with it, I'm going to both pay attention to the object itself and the color of the negative space, the value of the negative space. And that will help me to give my viewer more information, have more accuracy in my picture. So you start to see that popping out. And then within the object itself, the light's hitting, you know, front and up. So whatever's perpendicular to the light source is going to be the brightest area. So, you know, we might pull out some light here and then add more volume on the bottom and the sides, because as the pair turns away in space, it's getting less of that light source is reaching that other side of the volume. So you can see some things begin to happen where an object is going to feel more symmetrical or more believable and more three-dimensional as we're adding value into the idea here. Typically, you know, the closest a light source is to something, again, the brighter the highlights are going to be, but you're also going to have more sort of sharpness within a shadow. So more of a clear edge there to kind of show what's happening under that pair. We sort of have a cast shadow. And then in the opposite of a cast shadow, you're going to have some reflected light, which is light bouncing off of a surface and up onto another object or surface. So we'll end up with kind of a band of darkness here, of darker value here, and then a little bit of a lighter spot under here. But direct light value is always more contrast. You know, your highlight's always going to be lighter than your cast shadow. This pair needs a little help on its shape. And then we can go back and, you know, without really using line too much at all here, we certainly have some more information about what's happening with that pair. But you can definitely emphasize kind of the meaning of two values with more of a specific line as needed. So real quick, just I'm gonna kind of introduce Conte Crayon as another material so I can get to some real dark darks. I've got quite a lot of reflected light actually on this edge here of this cube. So my darkest darks are actually kind of over here. So I'm gonna go back in and start to build that value there. And then I've got a fair bit of darkness on the side of this pair. But you want your value scale with you. I kind of liken it to the viewfinder. The viewfinder is constantly giving you context. The value scale is another tool that is constantly giving you context so you can push back and forth and see really what's going on. Again, when I squint, I start to get more value in here. Oh, I forgot I wanted this mark, this textural mark for the wood to go up and down, kind of. But you can start to see sort of like where the light's coming from, how the shadows are being cast. We've got a brighter spot over here, more dark on this side. And again, let the material be the material. Don't smooth it out. If you need to build more value and you need to build more depth, just keep going over and over the material, all right? Just like in class when you're trying to make sure that you've got a good sense of proportion, with value you want to constantly step back and say, okay, do I believe what's happening here? Does the drawing have a sense of light? Does the drawing, I can see when I'm in my drawing really up close, working and messing around with different shapes and values, I'm not seeing the whole picture in quite the same way. So give yourself that step back in perspective so you can see really what's going on, and you can make more comparisons here to life. So look at the still life as much as you're looking at your drawing or more, and you'll be in good shape. All right, so I could, if I really want to imitate what's happening here in life, I'm going to work on this for quite a lot longer, but as we say, it's just a demo, so we'll stop here. Hopefully that was helpful.